Omar Ahmad loved languages the way other people loved their pets, deeply, irrationally, and with the occasional outburst of frustration. Right now, it was frustration's turn. No, he said, rubbing his temples and adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. The auxiliary verb goes before the temporal marker, not just in ceremonial contexts, always. His Xenolinguistics 401 class stared back at him like he'd asked them to conjugate verbs in dolphin. Omar scanned their blank faces and tried again. Okay, imagine someone at a Renaissance fair saying thee and thou because it's traditional, even though no one talks like that anymore. Same idea. A hand went up in the back. But Professor Ahmad, the student asked, why would aliens care about Renaissance fairs? Omar pinched the bridge of his nose and inhaled sharply. Before he could come up with an answer that wouldn't make things worse, someone knocked on the door. The man who walked in looked like he'd stepped out of a luxury catalog. His suit probably cost more than Omar's yearly salary. His shoes gleamed like obsidian, and his expression carried the smooth calm of someone who had never waited in line for anything in his life. Professor Ahmad, the man said, smiling. Matthew Dowse, CEO of Dowse Technologies. Mind if I borrow you for a moment? Omar hesitated, then waved to his class. All right. Class dismissed. Don't forget to review temporal marker placement for next week. As students filtered out, many trying to sneak photos of the tech mogul on their phones, all Dowse branded, of course, Omar tried to straighten his papers and look professional. He'd done translation work before, but never for someone with this level of power. Once the room was empty, Dowse took a seat in the front row, like a student who had never once in his life been one. I'll be brief, Dowse said. I hear you're the best translator of Fatile formal language on Earth. I wouldn't say, and your rates are a bargain compared to corporate firms. Omar gave a tight smile. Academia isn't exactly a high-paying industry. We need a translator, Dowse continued, waving away the conversation like it was beneath notice. The Fatile Trade Consortium controls most of the major shipping lanes in this sector. We've got a chance to break into their markets, specifically with the D-phone line. He pulled one of the sleek, curved devices from his pocket and placed it on Omar's desk like an offering. It gleamed, humming faintly. Their CEO, Betis Bodhisarian, has agreed to preliminary talks, Dowse said. But their formal business language is impossible to parse with standard AI, Omar finished for him. The ceremonial dialect has nested honorifics and idioms that don't translate cleanly. The AI probably keeps mistranslating commerce clauses as marriage proposals. Exactly, Dowse smiled. We need a human. Someone who understands nuance. Someone who won't accidentally insult the CEO's ancestors or offer to mate with them. Omar opened his mouth to respond, but Dowse slid a folded piece of paper across the desk. Omar unfolded it. It was a number. Per day, plus expenses. He blinked. That number could clear his student loans. All of them. His car, his house. He might even be able to replace the squeaky refrigerator. He carefully refolded the paper and set it down. When would the negotiations begin? Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Our building downtown. I'll have a car pick you up at 7. Daos stood, brushing imaginary dust from his flawless lapels. He gestured vaguely at Omar's worn tweed jacket. Also, wear something better. And just like that, he left, leaving behind the faint scent of cologne, a high-end phone, and a silence that felt heavier than before. Omar slowly sank into the nearest chair, his mind racing. He should have been elated. This was the kind of opportunity people waited their whole careers for. But something about the Fatil formal dialect had been tugging at him lately. Certain phrases, structures, a familiarity that didn't make sense. He needed to talk to Professor Roberts, his old mentor who had retired the year before. She was the one who'd sparked his obsession with alien languages in the first place. If anyone could help him sort through this gut feeling, it was her. First, though, he apparently needed a new jacket. As he packed up his materials, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Car will pick you up at 7. Don't be late. Also, the tweed really has to go. MD Omar looked down at his jacket. What's wrong with tweed? He asked the empty classroom. The classroom, predictably, didn't answer. The Dow's Technologies corporate headquarters lobby looked like it had been designed to intimidate. Everything gleamed. The walls were a white so pure it almost hurt to look at. The chairs were clearly the product of a design team that didn't believe in human spines. The plants looked like they'd been interviewed before being allowed in. Omar stood awkwardly near the entrance, freshly suited, clutching his briefcase like it might run away. Despite the tailored fit, he still felt like a kid playing dress-up. Matthew Dowse stood in the center of it all, chatting with a tall woman in a gray business suit who was frowning at her tablet. He looked somehow even more polished than yesterday. "Ah, Omar," Dowse said, flashing a smile. "Better than tweed." Omar bit back a retort. "Thank you. It was the best I could find on short notice." The woman with the tablet glanced up. "Consortium delegation just landed. They'll be here in 10. "Excellent," Dow said. Then to Omar, "Remember, formal, respectful, and don't let them think we're desperate." "Are you desperate?" Dowse smiled, thin and sharp. "We're eager. They want to maintain control of galactic shipping. We want to wedge our foot in the door. Just translate what I say and how I say it. Nothing more." The tablet chimed. "They're here." The doors opened. Omar had seen images of the Fatil before, but nothing prepared him for the reality of them. Batiste Bodhisarian entered like a walking tank in a bespoke suit. His iridescent shell gleamed under the lights. Behind him walked Mosin, tall, mantis-like, all angles and precise movement. A third figure followed, shorter, rounder, and visibly anxious. He juggled several data pads like they might bite him if mishandled. Omar stepped forward as Dowse began the formal greeting. He translated smoothly. Pleasantries, honorifics, welcomes. Then Batiste responded. Omar's brain stuttered. The phrasing was ceremonial, yes, but more than that. It was ancient, pre-collapse ancient. Language that hadn't been actively used since before the Fatil's first documented trade empire crumbled. "May our meeting prove worthy of the time value expended in its arrangement," Omar translated carefully. That wasn't just formal speech. That was a legal phrase from texts he'd studied during his research with Professor Roberts. "Tell him we're honored by his presence," Dowse said. Before Omar could speak, Batiste let out a clicking sound, translated by the company's AI as laughter. "No need for such formality," the Fatil CEO said, in accented but fluent English. "I merely wish to test your translator's capabilities." Impressive. For a freelancer, Omar's ears burned. Of course they spoke English. Of course they had their own translators. This meeting wasn't for trade. It was a test, and he was the one on trial. "Well," Dowse said smoothly, "Professor Ahmad is one of Earth's leading experts in xenolinguistics." "How charming," Batiste replied. "You humans do try so hard." He turned toward the meeting room, shell gleaming under the lights. "Shall we?" As the Fatil walked past, Omar noticed Mohsin glance back at him. The younger Fatil's mandibles twitched slightly. A smile? A warning? Omar wasn't sure which. Omar didn't remember the elevator ride down from the meeting room. He must have taken it because one minute he was translating archaic legal phrases, and the next he was standing outside the Dowse Tech Conference Center, blinking into daylight like he'd just emerged from a cave. Behind him, the meeting had concluded politely, but it was clear from Batiste Bodhisarian's tone and the amused twitch of Mohsin's mandibles that Earth's proposal had not impressed. Worse, Batiste had spoken fluently in English by the end, stripping away the illusion of necessity. The whole session had been a test, and Omar, despite translating flawlessly, had the uneasy sense that he'd been graded on a curve no one explained to him. Dowse caught up with him just outside the building, looking like he'd just returned from a 3-day retreat at a luxury spa. His smile was tight, not quite cracking under pressure. "What happened in there?" he asked. Omar hesitated. Their phrasing. It wasn't just formal language. It was ancient, older than anything in their modern trade records. Dowse squinted. "And this matters because..." "It matters because some of the phrases they used, especially the CEO's final statements, weren't just poetic. They're legal. From a pre-collapse trade code, I recognized them from the Proxima Dig archives. If they're using that language, intentionally or not, they might be invoking laws that are technically still binding." Dowse's expression shifted slightly, a glimmer of interest breaking through the impatience. "And that helps us. How?" "I'm not sure yet," Omar admitted, already pulling out his phone. "But I know someone who might be." "Fine. You've got 12 hours, Dowse said. "After that, if I don't have a reason not to fire you, I'm calling in one of the corporate firms." Omar didn't wait to respond. He was already walking, thumb scrolling through his contacts. He needed to find Professor Roberts. Now, Professor Juliet Roberts had always described her retirement as semi-fake. Her home looked less like a place where someone lived and more like the inside of an archive that had given up trying to stay organized. Piles of data pads teetered dangerously beside ancient printouts and rare alien language dictionaries. But somehow, she knew exactly where everything was. "I wondered how long it would take you to notice," she said, handing Omar a cup of strong floral tea. "Batiste is still using pre-collapse trade dialect? How delightful." "You knew?" Oh yes, since first contact, the moment I saw their greeting protocols. They're not just being formal, they're imitating ritual, old ritual, badly. Omar set down the tea. You're telling me the fatal consortium has based their entire trade negotiation system on fragments of an extinct legal dialect they barely understand? No, I'm telling you they've built their empire on a half-remembered ritual system they think they understand. She grinned. Which is why we're going to beat them with it. She began flipping through a dusty volume filled with hand-transcribed scans of ancient tablets. Here, she pointed to a phrase. May our meeting prove worthy of the time value expended. Sound familiar? Omar nodded. That's a rejection clause. It signals the end of a trade offer, but also opens a mandatory arbitration window. And if you respond with the proper counterphrase, they're legally bound to continue negotiation. Exactly. Omar stared at the text, mind racing. This isn't just translation, this is legal resurrection. We found these phrases in the Proxima ruins, she said. They didn't, which means we actually know more about their own trade law than they do. That's, he paused, incredible and probably dangerous. Only if you screw it up, she said brightly. Come on, you've got 10 hours. We need to rehearse everything from the binding clause counterphrase to the ritual implications of preliminary silence. The what? Didn't I mention? The pre-collapse fatal forbade outside commentary during preliminary exchanges. It's a rule. Invoking it should shut up anyone trying to interfere. Omar raised an eyebrow. That's real? Oh yes, and very, very useful. They worked through the night, poring over documents, memorizing counterphrases, and practicing delivery. Juliet paced like a coach prepping a quarterback for the final drive. Omar drank his weight in tea. When the sun started to rise, he didn't feel rested, but he felt ready. Remember, she said as he headed for the door, eyes bloodshot but voice sharp. The old laws are dense, weird, and painfully literal. If you use them, you must see them through. That includes all the ritual implications, all of them. What kind of implications? He asked. She gave him a dangerous smile. You'll find out. Back at Daos Tech, the lobby was somehow even shinier than before. But now Will Bates stood waiting in a suit that could have bought a small country. Ah, the Translator, Bates said, all charm and teeth. Hope you don't mind, but I thought I'd join today's discussions. Our Bates book line has potential too, and the consortium could benefit from competition. What he means, Dow said through gritted teeth as he pulled Omar aside, is that he invited himself. This changes nothing, Omar said, clutching the annotated scrolls Juliet had given him. Just let me talk. Don't react no matter how weird it gets. Dowse opened his mouth to respond, but the delegation arrived before he could. Batiste looked even more imposing today, his shell polished to a high shine. Mohsin followed, gaze flicking over every corner of the room. The legal advisor was already muttering. We have stated our position, Batiste said, voice full of dismissive finality. Omar stepped forward, heart pounding. In ancient Fatil, he spoke. In the name of the first traders, I invoke the right of secondary consultation. The room froze. The legal advisor stopped mid-chant. Mohsin blinked. Batiste turned slowly toward Omar. "What did you say?" Omar repeated it. Mohsin stepped forward, voice cautious but respectful. "Father, the clause is valid. If we reject now, we breach the founding charter." Daos raised an eyebrow at Omar. Omar gave a small nod. Batiste growled low in his throat, but backed down. "Very well. We continue." The negotiations resumed, but not in any form Earth's delegation expected. "Shall we proceed according to traditional structure?" Batiste asked. Omar translated. Daos agreed. "Then we begin," the legal advisor said, "with the dance of depreciating assets." There was a beat of silence. "I'm sorry," Daos said. "The what?" But it was already happening. A section of the wall slid away, revealing what looked like a combat arena. The floor glowed. Strange symbols lit up. A heat shimmer rose from below. "It's ceremonial," Mohsin said calmly. "A performance-based evaluation of financial competence." "You want me to dance?" Daos asked. "Interpretively," Omar clarified, "while symbolizing tax structures." "I've done worse," Daos muttered, removing his jacket. Omar watched as Daos and Mohsin took their places. Traditional music began, a mix of drums and what sounded like an executive stress playlist. The heat rose, lights flashed, and the dancing began. Mohsin was elegance incarnate. Daos, to Omar's shock, was not terrible. There was a rhythm to his movements, an angry sort of grace, like a PowerPoint given physical form. The legal advisor clapped. "Human gains 1 point. Very spirited demonstration of capital depreciation." The challenge escalated. Flame pits warmed. The temperature rose. Bates tried to jump in. Omar stopped him cold. "The chamber recognizes no new voices until primary exchange concludes." "That's not fair." "Actually," the legal advisor said, "that is canon." After Daos landed a compound interest pirouette and Mohsin executed a graceful tax shelter dive, the round ended. "The next challenge," the advisor announced, "is futures trading via competitive haiku." Daos turned to Omar. "You're kidding." Omar didn't even blink. "Nope." The two began reciting poetic metaphors for fiscal policy. Mohsin spoke with eerie elegance. Daos grunted out syllables that somehow still worked. "Oversold again, the trend line deceives us all. Margins disappear." The legal advisor beamed. "Traditional form, bonus points." Omar watched in disbelief as the room turned into a fever dream of finance and art. By the end of it, both parties were sweating. The flame pits were flickering ominously, and the air smelled like someone had tried to smelt a spreadsheet. And then, just as Omar thought it couldn't get stranger, the Trade Commission called in. The legal advisor paled. "The invocation of ancient law has triggered audit protocol. The archives are activating." "Impossible," Batiste said. "Apparently not," Mohsin murmured. The displays in the room lit up with maps, trade routes lost to history, blinking back into legal existence. Earth systems sat squarely in their path. Batiste turned to Omar. You knew this would happen." "I followed the old ways," Omar said calmly, "as a proper translator should." Batiste's shell shifted colors, rage, panic, resignation. Daos leaned in. "Now, Let's talk terms." Mohsin, barely hiding his smile, stepped forward. "We proceed in accordance with the old ways." "Good," Omar said, "because the next challenge is going to be weird." Daos gave him a sidelong glance. "Weirder than this?" "Depends," Omar said. "How do you feel about competitive limericks?" The ceremonial dining chamber smelled faintly of citrus polish and quiet desperation. Omar Ahmad stood at the threshold, clutching a tray of Professor Roberts's spring rolls, unsure whether to laugh or cry. The polished table before him, shaped like a concentric spiral of shared intent, was already laden with an eclectic spread of dishes, some steaming, some glowing faintly, and one very much alive. Aftil, the traditional centerpiece of a fatil feast, was burbling at the center of the table in a shallow containment dish. It looked vaguely like a moss-covered eel, except it had limbs and eyes, and if Omar wasn't mistaken, a kind of defiant charisma. He adjusted his glasses and set the spring rolls down next to what might have been a tub of fermented root pudding, though it was actively pulsing. The others trickled in. Matthew Dowse wore ceremonial business robes, because of course he did, tailored to look like something between a Wall Street power suit and a Jedi's day wear. Will Bates followed close behind, limping slightly from the last round of ritual limerick combat and wearing a sour expression that suggested he'd lost more than just corporate dignity. His assistant carried something that looked suspiciously like repackaged store-brand hummus. Professor Roberts arrived last, arms full of what smelled like real food, robes flowing, grinning like a trickster deity whose best prank was still unfolding. Baptiste Baudissarion entered with a heavy sigh, mandibles flexing, his shimmering shell now dulled with exhaustion. Mohsin was close behind, more composed but watching everything. The Fatil legal advisor carried a stack of data pads and a plate of something that looked like charcoal, but, judging by his reverent posture, was a delicacy. The chamber recognizes these offerings as appropriately traditional, Omar announced, to no one in particular and everyone all at once. They took their seats, with Baptiste at the head, flanked by Dowse and Bates, who made it a point to not acknowledge each other. Mohsin sat opposite, his posture formal, but his mandibles twitched with unspoken amusement as he scanned the dishes. As the first traders believed, the Fatil legal advisor intoned, commerce flows not only through currency, but through cuisine. That's not a real quote, Omar whispered to Professor Roberts. It is, she whispered back. Appendix C of the pre-collapse negotiation codex, right between the sections on soup spoon placement and acceptable bread warmth. You made that up. Did I? She said, too cheerfully. The F-Till lunged for a piece of dried kelp garnish. Mohsin calmly stabbed it with a two-pronged utensil, then popped it in his mouth. As is traditional, he said formally, chewing. Omar looked down at the spring rolls. I should have brought more. The conversation began slowly, tension still thick. Dowse opened with a suggestion of staggered route access. Bates added his desire for cross-platform distribution, while subtly pitching the Bates Book 2.0, which now featured a foldable stylus and, presumably, less tendency to burst into flames. But it was the food that gradually softened the edges. Batiste grumbled, but helped himself to a generous serving of a spicy earth dish that Omar had seen Professor Roberts bribe a customs officer to clear. When Omar translated a particularly obtuse regulation using a metaphor about soup logistics, Batiste actually chuckled. Not all of the dishes went over well. The fermented pudding made a Daos intern cry. The ftil tried to escape again. The charcoal thing hissed when exposed to air, but by the midpoint of the meal, everyone was eating, talking, negotiating. Something shifted. Bates passed a platter to Mohsin without snide commentary. Mohsin offered a compromise clause on shared oversight that made even Batiste raise a curious brow. Daos leaned back and, for once, didn't look like he was calculating margin reports in his head. Omar sat quietly for a while, watching. This was what Roberts had meant. This was what language could do when used well, not to obscure or overpower, but to connect. The old ways weren't just about law. They were about meaning. They demanded symbolism, yes, ritual, sometimes dance, but ultimately they were about respect and food, apparently. As they neared the final course, Batiste dabbed the corners of his mandibles with a napkin and stood. "These negotiations have been unorthodox," he said, "and occasionally humiliating." Mohsin cleared his throat. Batiste sighed. "But they have also been honest and enlightening." He looked to Omar. "Your invocation of the ancient codes was clever, perhaps even wise. You used our own traditions better than we did." Omar swallowed, unsure whether that was a compliment or a warning. "Let it be known," Batiste continued, "that the Fatil Consortium recognizes Earth's petition for shared access. Let mutual benefit begin." The legal advisor made a small squeaking noise of approval and recorded the declaration. Daos raised a glass. "To fair exchange," Omar raised his own, "and new traditions." They clinked glasses. Even Bates joined in, though reluctantly. Mohsin lifted his own cup in silent amusement. The Ftil gurgled and, as if accepting the terms, finally stopped trying to crawl off the table. Afterward, when the guests were gone and the room was quiet again, Omar lingered. Roberts stood beside him, arms folded, satisfied. "You knew it would end like this," he said. "Not exactly," she replied. "I hoped. Also, I wanted to see Daos do a tax dance. That alone was worth the wait." Omar smiled quietly, his first real one in days. "What now?" he asked. "Now?" She turned to him. "You write it down, every part, before someone forgets how powerful words can be." Omar nodded, watching the steam rise from the empty plates, the traces of ancient rituals completed over tea and spring rolls and compromise. He didn't know where this was all headed next. Maybe Earth would finally find its place in galactic commerce. Maybe more ancient codes would resurface. Maybe more people would realize that history wasn't something dead and buried, but alive and hungry, like a fitil at a feast. But for now, he picked up his briefcase and his jacket, tweed, thank you very much, and walked out of the ceremonial chamber, feeling for the first time like a translator not just of words, but of worlds. The door shut behind him with a soft chime, and the glow of the ancient chamber faded to a warm memory. Somewhere in the archives, forgotten protocols stirred again, and Omar Ahmad was ready for whatever came next.